Hello, friends of History of Science channel at the University of Coimbra and Aveiro. The question of reality and how to understand what reality is, the different approaches that are possible, um, came into my mind in a clear way when I was a young anthropologist 37 years ago in the Peruvian Amazon, living with Ashaninka people and trying to understand their point of view on the rainforest and how they used their natural resources. Well, natural resources was what I thought I was investigating. But the Ashaninka didn't even have words for natural resources. Um, they didn't even have a word for nature, the idea, everything outside of the human sphere. That's the Western definition of nature. And here were these people living in this very bioactive rainforest, and yet they didn't have a word for everything that was not human. It seemed pretty clear to me that they had a different understanding of simply plants, animals, other species. They had a kind of an intimate knowledge of the plants in the rainforest. So they had names for just about every species of plant. They ascribed uses to half of them. So they had verifiable empirical knowledge about plant species that was superior to the knowledge of Western science about those plants. There were more names in Ashaninka for Amazonian plants than in Latin given by scientists. So these people had deep knowledge about the plants in their environment, but they spoke of them as if they were people. Different species had personalities and a kind of a mother or a father, a protector, an owner, an invisible entity that somehow supervised each individual in that species. Um, well, I didn't think that was reality at that point as a young 25-year-old Western rationalist, materialist, humanist. Uh, I thought that that was just superstition. I never really thought about it much. I was educated in the 1960s and 70s in the suburbs of the Western world. And in those days, uh, you did not think that plants had a personality or that they were anything more than automatons or objects, passive objects. But so here were these Amazonian people talking about plants as if, well, they had an intelligence inside them. So for me, this was somewhat of a mystery because I had come to understand how they used the rainforest and how they thought about it. But the way that they actually thought about the forest was off the charts of what was considered serious, acceptable knowledge. So they were animists, and they believed in invisible beings that animated plants and animals. And so they weren't to be taken seriously, let's just say. And for an anthropologist, this was okay because, of course, indigenous people speak metaphorically, and that's our job, is to listen to their stories and then try to make sense of them. So, but still, what was surprising was that these Ashaninka people had empirical knowledge about plants, and they prepared sophisticated psychoactive plant brews like ayahuasca. So they kept on telling me, look, if you want to understand what we're saying about plants, what you have to do is drink this plant mixture. It's the television of the forest. It'll show you images and you'll learn things. Well, I didn't actually think that this was true, but I didn't really think that you could learn verifiable plant properties by drinking a hallucinogenic plant mixture. But I was still curious. So I tried their kamarampi, is how they say it in their language. And the experience was life-changing, but also too much for me as a young university student to talk about it to my professors. But at the same time, it was a very powerful worldview shifting experience that came out of drinking a plant mixture, which confirmed what these Ashaninka people were saying, was that you can take plants, certain plants, and you ingest them, and then they will show you images and teach you things. So to a certain extent, their animistic view of the world could be verified. And so at that point, I started thinking that there was a kind of a no man's land or unexplained world here. I'd reached the limits of Western knowledge at that point. And then the limits said, you've got to turn around here, because going any further, you get into the subjective, animistic, non-rational, non-verifiable terrain. This is where rational knowledge stops. And if you actually take that step and take seriously what the indigenous Amazonian people are telling you, you are walking out of the building, walking out of science, walking out of the space in which we take you seriously. Well, to me, there was simply a question, well, basic intercultural politeness, which is you ask people questions and they give you answers. I mean, the least you can do is take them seriously. That's one thing. The second thing is that these people had impressive, verifiable knowledge about plants that went further than scientific knowledge about those plants. So what did this mean, that we had to turn around and that we couldn't actually have a conversation with them in their own terms about their own knowledge? In fact, we could take their plants and turn them into pharmaceutical products, thank you very much. But we couldn't even sit down and have a polite conversation with them about the origin of their own knowledge as they themselves talk about it. So for me, it was also a question of human rights. If we are really going to respect indigenous people, then we've got to find a way of having a conversation with them about their knowledge that takes it seriously. So it was actually that wish to, as an activist in favor of indigenous people, as I wanted to find a way to get indigenous people invited to the table where people talk about serious knowledge. And so that meant finding a way of bridging that canyon or that no man's land, and ignoring those signs that say you've reached the limits of science. Actually, that's the interesting place to be, the limits of science. That's what Thomas Kuhn said in the History of Scientific Revolutions, is that the people who bring about change and progress in science are those who go to the limits of the paradigm and question those limits. So I was primed by having read Thomas Kuhn. So I knew that having found that place where it said, you have to turn back here or else you're leaving the limits of Western knowledge, that was actually an enormous opportunity, because it meant that by ignoring that sign and going forward, possibly I might help bring about a new way of understanding these things. So that's how I came to write a book that tried to go back and forth between what science says about plants and animals and life forms on Earth, and what Amazonian people say. And in this book, The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and the Origins of Knowledge, I show that that these two sides, let's say scientists and shamans, are looking at the same reality, which is life on Earth and how to heal people who are sick, and very similar questions, but from different angles, coming up with analogous conclusions, as if they were really looking at the same reality from different angles. So what you see is something different, but that if you put the two perspectives together, they complement each other. And for me, that was perhaps the biggest surprise in this work, was that not only did there seem to be another way of understanding life that had its coherence, but that it could actually be combined with the scientific way, and that the two together revealed an even richer tapestry by having two approaches, different but complementary approaches to knowledge. It's like having two camera angles. You see it, the what you see looks different, but you see things from one angle that you wouldn't see from another angle. So if you know how to go back and forth between perspectives, you can actually get a richer understanding of things. And so that's what I think I'd have to say about, so the questions of what is reality? Well, reality itself is this complex locus of negotiation. You could say, okay, from one perspective, you see one perspective on reality, fine. Then from an opposite perspective, you'll see another side of reality. Well, obviously, reality is like a multifaceted ball. And so if you can multiply perspectives, multiply going back and forth and circling around, and this is in fact how Amazonian shamans talk about the correct way of approaching the invisible entities that animate life forms, is that they're necessarily complex and ambiguous, and the only way to approach them is by circling around them with metaphoric language. They say that when ayahuasca shamans, when they sing in an indirect metaphoric language, where they don't say anaconda, they say hammock, because anacondas sometimes look like hammocks when they hang from trees. They don't say jaguar, they say basket, because some fibers used to make baskets have patterns similar to the jaguar's markings. And this is the way that you can sing to and have get information from these entities. With frontal words, you'd crash into them. What you need to do is speak to them in this indirect and metaphoric language, Tsai yoshto yoshto and yaminawa, twisting. And by always making it, always a combination of ambiguity, you can actually circle around these complex entities and get a full understanding of them. And I think that's the way forward here is, yes, the rational gaze on reality is important, but yes, the gaze of indigenous Amazonian people, for example, is also important. And if one looks at just a question like, what is a plant? Well, I would want it to be a yoshto answer, always twisting and combining the two. I would want to know about the botany and about the cells and about the substances that the plant contains. I would also want to know what the shamans say about the personality of this plant and the stories that they tell about this plant. And if you can combine for those two perspectives, I think you reach a fuller understanding of what that plant is. But at the end of the day, so what is reality? What is a plant? Is it a bag of substances? Is it an entity that actually has something like a personality? Or is it all of those things together? That is the question.
Se você gostou desse vídeo, dê um like, compartilhe. Aproveite para assinar o canal e ative as notificações.